So obviously it's still ongoing, this big fire. Um, but there's been news conferences within like the last minute as well. Um, but what do you think it will be the rebuilding process for Los Angeles, and
Mm,
how will the community who's experienced this disaster recuperate within the coming weeks or months?
mm. Well, I think the first thing to say is that this will very much depend on the sort of eventual scale of the damage. I mean, what is clear is that it is already a large scale event. Um, and reconstruction has to be approached on different levels, right?
Yeah.
From the individual families affected to the local urban levels and potentially also to the national level, not least because LA plays a very important role
Mm.
in the national and indeed global economy. So that's we need to figure out what the extent of the damage is before we can start really planning for reconstruction. But the point about the process is that it starts just as soon as destruction happens.
Mm.
So very quickly, the first phase, as it were, is the emergency response. It's about protecting people and then protecting property as much as it is possible to do. Sorry, I've been sick.
Mm.
And then it is about dealing with the immediate needs of those populations. So that's going to be, shelter, potentially food, and of course, healthcare for those who are injured. Then you have to deal with the human losses.
Mm.
What is striking so far, considering the scale of the damage, is the relative limited number of death, right? I mean, this obviously is likely to change, sadly, but that actually shows that for all the criticism that you hear already about the emergency response and the response of the fire services, um, lives have been protected, right? And that
Mm.
and that that is the first thing. Um, and then the rest of the process will unfold. There are all sorts of debates in the field about how this process should be conceived. It is difficult to, I mean, we like to, or practitioners like to divide the process into neat, clear-cut phases, right? Sort of emergency, recovery, long-term reconstruction, right? And
Mm.
then often memorialization at the end. Um, but in fact, this process sort of happens throughout. So to take the example of memorialization, that is usually the thing that is expected to happen at the end of the process. Well, what we know when we talk to and when we read the testimonies of victims is that starts as soon as the destruction happens.
Yeah.
I was listening to a podcast earlier. One of the victim was talking about the difficulties to choose whatever personal belongings they were going to rescue and keep with them for the rest of their
Mm.
lives, right?
Yeah.
So that just to indicate that while it is tempting to divide this process into neat phases, it is way more complex because everything's happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, let's take for instance the sort of recovery slash reconstruction period. Well, you're gonna have people who've lost their homes, so they will turn to the insurers or to their friends, and they will try to find and then fund shelter, for instance, right?
Mhm.
That can take weeks. That can be just a matter of a few days, or it can take months or indeed years. So that very much depends on the resources that those people have access to. And
Mhm.
unsurprisingly, it is a situation in which it is much better to be sort of young, healthy, and rich than old, poor, and sick, right?
Yeah.
So that is also part of the difficulty that we have to bear in mind, or the complexity and the fact that the system that we have in place um, appear to be no longer able to cope, and in particular the insurance markets. And I
Hmm.
think that's something that is very very important. I mean, I've seen on social media and and in the press a lot of criticism of insurers such as State Farm, for instance, which is one of the biggest and better known insurance in the US, that had basically dropped insurance policies in many of the areas affected by the fire because of previous wildfires.
Okay.
Now, a lot of people saying, well, isn't that disgusting to see insurance companies dropping their cover? But this actually is just a feature of the system that we've built, which is the market-based mechanism to cover losses as a result of a risk.
Hmm.
But it is a business. And the point of an insurance company is to make money. And when they reach the stage when the risk exceeds the benefits that the profit they're likely to make, then they're going to pull out of this particular market.
Yeah.
And you see this in LA at the moment. You see this in coastal regions of Europe. For instance, there are plenty of coastal towns in France that can no longer get insurance, for instance, for their public buildings. So
Hmm.
that actually speaks to the fact that we really entered into a phase where um, market-based solutions simply cannot cope. So it's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, we can come back to this, right? But it's going to be very
Hmm.
interesting to see how that unfolds, and whether that brings about a real debate about this, because this will have policy implications.
Hmm. And within this reconstruction moving forward process, will how will is there a way for infrastructure to be adapted to cope with future uh, a bigger increase in the frequency of these disasters? For example, water provisions in really dry western US states, which are already under strains. How can we possibly better provide for this possibility?
Well, here the question is not exclusively about infrastructure. So you're right in that that this is about resources, and in particular about water. Now, water is problematic here. Water is clearly problematic because it is the lack of water, the lack of rain, that has turned those areas into prime combustible material. But it's less a question of infrastructure, less a question of water supply, than the question of the actual drain that the
Mm.
particular economic system of California. And there you need to think not just about the needs of those big cities, but also the needs of Californian agriculture, that has been sort of investing and specializing in crops that required a huge amount of water. So avocados, peanuts, for instance, to the point that Californian aquifers are in many places empty, and the soil is collapsing in many
Mm.
areas, right? So there's a much bigger water crisis in California that actually speaks to the wider economic system of the state, and that goes beyond the urban. But it's very clear that cities do only increase the drain on those resources. Now, there's something else which is very relevant to this conversation, which is not exclusive to California, but which is a real problem across the United States. And that is the fact that cities that have been growing, and LA is a perfect example, right? I mean, it's the archetypical sprawling city,
Mm.
right? Made possible and designed for the automobile back in the 1920s and 30s, that kept on growing. And that kept on growing and encroaching upon the natural environment. And what planners are focusing on is what they call the wildland urban um, um, oh, no, I've lost the it's WUI wildland urban interface. I cannot quite I might be getting this wrong. I'll check this out for
English.
you. Sorry,
Yeah, yeah, it's
it's
all right.
been a long day. But basically, you're now building houses and cities in the middle of forests that are obviously likely to be affected by wildfires.
Yeah.
So here the question is perhaps less that of infrastructure than about urbanization itself. Now, we might want to come back to this when it comes to the sort of political responses to the crisis, but this is something that is true of California, that you see in many other places, including a lot of Republican states across the southern United States and in Texas in particular. But there is here link with urban development in regions that are increasingly vulnerable to climate change.
Mm.
So our good friend Donald Trump is very likely to face a situation in which all the real estate that he owns, that he's invested in the coastal regions of Florida, is likely to subside into the ocean.
Mm. And how long would
Right.
that process take?
Well, I mean, there's all sorts of studies about this, but I mean, essentially by 2050, I cannot remember exactly where and when this is
Mm.
going to happen. The UN Intergovernmental Panel has run a number of studies on this. So this is one of the things that they model with the rise of sea waters around the world. So that is a problem for the US. That is a problem for many coastal regions around the world. But
Mm.
the point here is that the 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 question is that of climate change, but it's also about continuing development and expansion of cities into vulnerable areas that have
Yeah.
always been vulnerable, but now increasingly so in the current context.
Yeah. So do you think, in relation to one of my other questions about how this whole anthropogenic human-induced problem has come about, do you think this sort of development in vulnerable urban areas could could be slowed by, or do you think the Trump administration is has too far gone for any real bold progressive moves such as this?
Hmm. So there are two dimensions, I think, to this question. The first one is the relationship between the fire and anthropogenic climate change. Wildfires have always existed, right? So
Mm.
this is not a new development. This happens. But what we do have now is a situation in which there are compounded by climate change.
Yeah,
So
that's
this is not, in other words, the sort of prime cause of the fires, but it certainly contributes to turning them into major major crisis. I think it's there's this sort of very easy argument to make here, and you can see where that is leading. Is that obviously when you have an administration like the Trump administration that denies the reality of climate change, denies the link between the extraction of fossil fuel and the rise in temperature, we cannot really expect anything to happen,
mm,
right?
yeah,
So that's the sort of easy, not easy. I'm not saying, sorry, let me rephrase this. Um, I think it is a fairly obvious point to make. It is a necessary point to make because, after all, these people are in charge and they need to be placed before their responsibility. But I think the responsibility is much wider than right-wing populists. The truth is, how many of us, and including myself in this, how many of the people you know, are your parents, your friends, my colleagues, are actually ready to make the necessary change to transform our economic system, because essentially this is what we are talking about, right? This is about
mm,
a radical reconfiguration of the way we live in order to mitigate the impact of climate change. And the reason why I make this point is that I think it is too easy to blame this on an easy target like Trump. Now,
yeah,
we should definitely blame these people and climate change deniers because they are dangerous, but that should not be an excuse for the rest of us to shy away from on responsibility,
mm,
right? So that's an important point I think to make, because I think the moment you start looking into specific policy prescriptions, you soon realize that resistance is not simply coming from those people,
mm. We're
right?
all implicated. Or,
Yeah, exactly. So I think that we face. I mean, I'm just stating something that I'm sure you've heard about 200 times already, right? But we all individually and collectively across the world facing very hard choices, and well, most of us would rather take the path of least resistance, right? And avoid this kind of conversation until we're confronted with it.
mm,
Um, Now, here the difficulty, and that's something that I want to write about because I find this quite striking. You would probably think, well, the very victims of climate change, of those wildfires, of floods in the UK, for instance, or in the rest of Europe, these are the very people that should easily mobilize and sort of activate politically in order to effect the change that would mitigate the impact of climate change.
mm,
And yet that doesn't seem to happen. I mean, you see in many of those regions, you see right-wing populists, climate change deniers actually doing quite well in elections.
mm,
Well, I think that speaks to the very difficulty for the devastated communities to um, really think in those terms when they face the disaster, not just for the few days or a few weeks that the disaster is covered in the media, but for many of those communities, this is going to be the defining feature of their existence, in many cases for years. Right. So I think this is something that we need to take into consideration as well. The people who could speak with the greatest authority of the impact of climate change are not necessarily those who are actually in the sort of material as well as psychological conditions to mobilize
yeah,
politically, right? So some of them do, right? You see this in particular in the global south, but it is exceedingly difficult for them because they are still facing an emergency, right? Where are we going to live tonight? I'm going to feed my kids. What's happening to my work? You know, um, so this is something worth considering, right? When we think about the political responses.
mm. Okay, thank you. And you mentioned in your earlier in this response about is this a conversation we'd prefer to ignore right until the last minute? Which I think for many people they would say so. Um, prefer to push it under the rug until everything is burning. Um, so you touched on memorialization as well and how that is the end of the process. Do you think the growing frequency of these crises is increasing the urgency of our responses, our personal responses, or do you think we are actually just waiting for the next fire to put out?
Well, so first of all, when I said it is usually considered to be the end of the process, that is the way it is usually presented. I don't actually think that this is true, right?
Okay.
But I think it's a fact that is not yet reflected in the literature. So it's one of the things that I want to work on with colleagues. Um, um, it is not an easy question um, to answer. because so memorialization happens at different levels, right? So those disasters are always going to be remembered at the level of communities and individuals and families, right? Because it will mark a before and an after in the lives of these people.
Yeah.
When we do think about memorialization, we also think about commemoration in a sort of official public sense of the term, right? In the way that we think of the memory of military conflicts, for instance, where those events, or to take an example of this week, the commemoration of the terrorist attack of 2015 in Paris, 10 years ago. So this week was a week of commemoration, for instance. But in many ways, the question that I have, that I'm grappling with, is about the extent to which the strength of the commemoration, the intensity of the commemoration, is also not the product of what is considered to be the exceptional, extraordinary nature of the crisis. Now, what happens when those disaster become no more the exception, but the norm? I mean, think about flooding in Britain over the last 5 years. This has become a regular occurrence. I live in Oxford, so there are some fields that have basically been flooded for the best part of 12 months.
Okay.
That in itself is a sort of very anecdotal illustration of the ways in which we are now moved into a very different phase of our existence, right? Now, if your city is flooded every year, as it is the case in many parts of the country, are you going to be commemorating every flood?
Yeah. So like a crude way to explain it is that disasters have lost their novelty in some respects.
Yeah, and this is well, and I think it also stresses the fact that it is very difficult to offer an objective definition of a disaster. So some of my colleagues do speak of disasters as interpretive fiction, and what they mean by that is that is called a disaster an event that is considered to be I'm going to quote a fellow historian, Jacob Remes at NYU, who think about uh, writes of disaster as suffering out of place.
Okay.
So it's suffering that is noted, that is remarked upon, that is commemorated because it is considered to be out of place, out of the ordinary. So let me take an example. As a result of those wildfires, there will be thousands of people that tonight are homeless. But California has been in the grip of a homelessness crisis for at least a decade.
Okay.
One type of homelessness is going to be considered a disaster, but not the other.
Mm.
That in itself is interesting because you're objectively looking at the situation of individuals or family that now find themselves living on the street.
Yeah.
In one case, they will be held responsible for their situation. In the other, this is going to be considered the product of a disaster. Now that in itself is quite, I think, revealing of the kind of processes that we are looking at here. So that's the reason why the disaster cannot simply be defined, for instance, by its scale or the number of dead or even the economic cost. The disaster is essentially defined by the communities who present it and experiences as a disaster, as a rupture in the existing order of things, if you will.
Before and after.
Exactly.
Okay. And how can these before and after pivotal moments like we've experienced this in the past few hours, days, or even recently, it was also 20th anniversary of the Boxing Day tsunami, which was just a natural occurrence anyway. But how can these have national and international consequences for global economics in terms of the functioning of transfer of resources and trade and everything?
Okay, so this will again, there are two things to consider here. One will be the actual impact. One of the questions, I mean, LA, like all cities, um, cities are places of accumulation. They are concentration of people, of power, of capital. They're centers of economic activities. And in the case of Los Angeles, this is a place which is tightly integrated into global economic networks.
Mm.
The question will then be to figure out whether the wildfires will have an obvious significant economic impact on those global economic networks that LA is part of. We don't know yet, but let's imagine, for instance, that in the next few days, I haven't actually looked at the news in the last couple of hours, but um, I read that some parts of Hollywood were threatened. Well, imagine, for instance, that let's say 30 or 40% of the actual infrastructure of the movie industry is destroyed as a result of the fire. That will have an impact on the global cinematographic production. So we might notice the difference on our on whatever streaming platform we use, for instance, right?
Mm.
So that's the reason why that's the type of things that we don't yet know, because we need to that will depend on the scale of the damage. So that's for the actual nature and scale of the event. Then that depends on the interpretation of the event.
Mm.
So going all the way back to the ancient and early modern period, but even in the case of many contemporary disasters, there is a recurrence of religious interpretations. So when Hurricane Katrina destroyed New Orleans, for instance, a number of evangelical Christians sort of reprised a very old idea among religious fundamentalists that the city had been punished for the sins of its inhabitants.
Mm.
That's exactly the kind of discourses that were circulating in after the Lisbon earthquake in 1755, right? Now, these are now minority views, right? The question is whether those disasters are going to be considered to be a natural disaster or not.
Mm.
And where I'm coming from the field of critical disaster study, I mean, our entire field is predicated upon the notion that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. What that means is that a fire, a wildfire, for instance, it's an environmental event, right? Like an earthquake, it's a geological event. That is
Mhm.
not a disaster in and of itself. What turns that event into a disaster is the fact that in this case, we built the city, Los Angeles, and built such a sprawling city that it exposed its population to wildfires. So what makes the disaster is the contact, as it were, the encounter between the hazard, in this case,
Mhm.
the fire, and a vulnerable population,
Yeah.
right? Which means that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, because what is making it a disaster is the choices that we made to build the city in the way we did, to build houses, for instance, that are not technically designed to mitigate the impact of fires or earthquakes, for instance. Now, once you move into that kind of interpretation, you can probably see what I'm getting at here.
Mhm.
You're raising political questions.
Yeah.
Because one could be as simple as, well, they are building codes. Why are they in place in some cities but not in others? We've seen this in Turkey after the recent earthquake, for instance, right? When a lot of people complained about corruptions of local officials that basically allowed buildings to be erected in contravention of all existing building codes, for instance. But in some places, there's actually no regulation whatsoever. So then the responsibility is with the legislator. You can see how that maps out onto important existing political debate about the role of government,
Hmm.
the role of the market, and we discussed this in relation to insurance industry, and of course, to go back to something we've discussed already, if you consider that anthropogenic climate change is a thing that needs to be addressed, then that raises political questions as well. So you can see how this can turn into and I think should turn into a very important political discussion in the full sense of the term, because it is about the way power is exercised. Um, and this is not just about whether bureaucracy or the fire services are efficient enough. This is also about what state assemblies or municipal authorities are legislating about. And it is also about the kind of society that we want to live in, that we want to build in. It's about the
Mm.
balance between state and market forces, for instance, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So when we describe it as a disaster, it's a human imposition on the whole, on naturally occurring circumstances which threaten us directly, and by extension, so the climate emergency is distinctly an emergency only for us humans who are the sentient ones dealing with this.
Well, I think it is an emergency for many other species. I
Mm.
mean, there's a real crisis of biodiversity, for instance. Now, what we can assume is that once we disappear as a species, which is possible, right? As a species, the Earth will still be there,
Yeah.
assuming we don't nuke ourselves and out of
Hmm.
existence, which sounds quite tricky to do anyway. It might kill all of us, but might not explode the entire planet. So there will be a profound reconfiguration of the ecosystem, but that will be accompanied by, and that's the reason why we're talking about the sixth mass extinction, right? This is being accompanied by the loss of natural life in all sorts of different forms. So we are responsible for it, but we're definitely not the first and only victims of it.
Mm. I think maybe if I have one more question or
Sure.
um and yeah, so we you briefly touched on uh the right-wing populist reaction to such things. President-elect Trump in earlier this afternoon, our time, said that the response of the Democrat institutions was great one of gross incompetence. Which begs the question what the Republican institutions would have done. But so how would these critical disasters um uh do you think they separate and divide communities more than we've seen them come together in LA recently? Do you think radical politics is exacerbated by the influence of these human induced or involved disasters?
Um, Again, there's a question of the level, the scale at which you are considering this question. Um, I think what you see at the level of communities is usually a great deal of solidarity and mutual aid, and a surprising amount, uh, and that is quite often actually underplayed by authorities who very often actually emphasize criminality for instance, and
Yeah.
looting in the wake
Oh,
of disaster, when quite often the evidence does not bear this out. And there are plenty. I could give you a lot of examples. I'm going to write an entire chapter on this uh, in my book. So at community level, you'll see a lot of people mobilizing. What you then have, then you have political actors who are trying to milk the situation. I mean, that's exactly what's happening with the incoming Trump administration, not least, of course, because they're not in charge, right?
mm.
So it's it's super
Perfect
easy.
timing.
Exactly, right? It's perfect. So I just saw that Donald Trump Jr. had tweeted about the fact that the fire services is run by women, apparently. So he takes this as an example of the LA Fire Service is run by I think two or three women, and therefore sees the fire as evidence of the failure of equality and diversity policies, right? So what you have are political actors, in particular irresponsible political actors, who will use any kind of event to project onto the situation whatever agenda they're pursuing. Um, and it's all the easier that California is overwhelmingly a democratic state. I haven't looked at the details, but I'm pretty sure that most of those communities are run also by
Yeah.
democratic officials at the municipal and local level. But um, there will be another disaster after January. I mean, you can bet a lot of money on this. In fact, I don't imagine any bookmakers is going to take your bet because it is so blindingly obvious. This is going to happen in Florida. This is going to happen in Texas. This is going to happen in many Republican states at a time when Trump will be in charge. And this is where you will have to see how they respond to this. George W. Bush actually suffered a great deal politically from his response to Hurricane Katrina.
Okay.
So those events can have very significant political implications. Um, but we'll have to see how that turns out. I mean, what's obvious is that they will be confronting a very similar situation much sooner than they expect, and we'll have to see how they respond to that.
And once this does descend on other states like Florida in terms of flooding or hurricanes, do you think at that point, when different states across one of the most geographically diverse countries in the world have experienced disaster and an emotional impact on their lives, do you think at that point it is truly a global disaster when so many stakeholders are involved? Will desperation to tackle problems that we might have been a part of creating only begin in per se when it extends to everyone?
Well, there's a great book on that. I'm reading it at the moment because I've been meaning to read it for a good couple of years, by Kim Stanley Robinson, Ministry for the Future. Robinson is one of the sci-fi authors who's written quite a lot about the climate crisis, and including urban disasters, actually. And in Ministry for the Future, this is actually, I mean, I've just started, right? I haven't finished the book yet, but
Yeah.
this is very much what is um, envisaging is a situation in which the severity of the climate crisis and emergency is really prompting a profound reorganization of the global political system. This is clearly not where we're at yet. That's the reason why it is still a work of science fiction, but it is one of those issues that can only be addressed through international collaboration, right? Through
Mm.
solidarity, because it is very obvious that it is very obvious that um, market mechanisms, for instance, are not the solution because the insurance industry is simply and interestingly, the insurance industry has actually been making the economic argument for quite some time now, um, for radical climate change intervention.
Mm.
Now, those guys are not exactly radical anti-capitalist, right? But what they're saying is that the economic cost is such that we must absolutely invest and transform our relationship to fossil fuel, simply because the market is not going to be able to provide the solution. And this is what we are seeing right now. Quite how this is going to pan out. The problem we have is one of temporality, is one of temporal horizons, right? Because these politicians are driven by a political cycle that usually lasts hardly more than a couple of years. Corporations are driven by the financial reporting cycle that can be as short as a quarter, and are very usually reluctant to make any kind of long-term, or to accept any kind of long-term intervention that is so obviously in the interests of everyone, including their own shareholders, right? I mean, this is what's completely infuriating in many ways. But you still have enough people who say, well, actually, I'll be dead, and my kids are going to be dead. Now, we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens when luxury real estate is drastically affected. And that's going to be an interesting thing about this fire, by the way, because these are diverse communities, but communities that tend to be fairly affluent. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether among all those wealthy actors, whether any one of those guys is actually going to, come out and stand up for a different kind of climate change intervention, for instance. We'll have to see. But what are the chances of Donald Trump changing his tunes once Mar-a-Lago is underwater? I mean, he will probably be dead by then, but what about the chances of his sons or grandkids to do that? I guess
only when it becomes our problem.
Exactly, because who's going to pay, right? I mean, that's always the and this is a great advantage that large private institutions know they have, and we've seen this during the financial crisis. Is that the rest of us are always here to cover the cost. So we pay twice effectively, right? We suffer the consequences, and we have to cover the cost through either our taxes or through our insurance premium. It's just one final point. I was just going to say this because something that I've had at the back of my mind for a long time, and I cannot understand for the life of me why environmental movements are not better at communicating the sort of quotidian practical implications of climate change. When all those fancy houses that are going up in flames, right? They're insured by companies that depend on this, not just on the insurance, on the what we call the reinsurance markets. That's the global market, which means that whenever there's a very large scale event of this kind, every single one of us will end up paying more when we insure our flats or houses, because premiums are going to go up. So you cannot say, well, I don't have to care. I live in the UK, weather is terrible, and we don't have to worry about wildfires. Well, although there were fires around London a couple of years ago. But actually you do, because your insurance premium is going to go up. So the question is how can we envisage a situation in which those interconnection are turned into solidarity, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Right? Because there's a link. We all pay the costs. Question is, do we realize these interconnections, and do we then do something about this?
So if you're saying that if climate movements combine on this idea that they'll have to pay the cost, it could result in greater cohesion of the movement and more action being taken if we understand our potential ramifications.
Yeah, I think the great difficulty for people for the environmental movements is that the emergency is not an emergency that is going to affect most people in their lifetime. That is
Mm.
likely to affect um, our children and grandchildren. And so the difficulties that they face if they're a different timeline, a timeline that just doesn't translate politically. So they have an incontrovertible scientific and even economic argument to make. The problem is that it's very difficult to communicate this, to translate this into sort of immediate um, implications and consequences for the voter, the taxpayer now.
Mm.
And I think this is the great difficulty. I think most people, I think the immense majority of people now understand that the climate is changing, right? They might not understand how that works, but they're not stupid, right? They probably don't have much time or energy to pay much attention to this. But the difficulty for them is they're thinking, okay, well, this clearly is happening. I can see this, right? But I've got another problem, right?
Mm.
I need to feed my kids. I need to think about housing, about my job, right? I mean, quotidian is taking over. Daily life is taking over. So what I think is, and it's much easier for me to raise the question than to find the answer, right? I mean, typical academic, right? um, I'm going to tell you what is wrong, but I'm not going to tell you what is the solution. Is that you need to figure out a way to demonstrate that this problem that is unfolding over decades or century is already having a practical, noticeable impact now.
Mm.
And I think insurance is one of the ways to do that. Is to say, look, we are all stakeholder in this global insurance market, and as a result, we're all paying the price. And we're going to pay the price in two different ways. If we're affected by the disasters because an insurance company may no longer be able to provide us with cover, so we're going to be left alone,
Mm.
or rather, as customer of those companies that are going to be raising the premiums in order to cover the costs and maintain the profitability of their businesses.
Okay. Mm.
Um, so there's something there, I think, which could be deployed politically, but that's probably for people that are smarter than I am to sort out.
Mm. Well, it's been a lot to take in. 50 minutes as well.
No
Um,
worries. Yeah, that's fine.
well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.